Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today are my good friends Doug and Zoo for an on-the-fly live conversation about Rosicrucianism, Asherah worship, and many other fascinating subjects pertaining to the history of the Jewish people and much more. Before we get started, please make sure you've joined us on the Temple Mount Discord server, and especially make sure you've subscribed to our excellent Temple Mount YouTube channel, where we have excellent new podcasts being uploaded every single day. Subscribe now. You're not going to want to miss them. That being said, welcome, Doug. Welcome, Zoo. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to step aside and let you guys manage this conversation however you want. And I think we're going to start with the first question from Doug. Thank you so much.
So, in your framework of history, where did the Israelis or Jews start from? Like, what year, what civilization and region? Because you had mentioned they're from Samaria, but Abraham isn't within. And you asked who was the greatest patriarch, and I missed the question. Just sorry, I went over my head, but it was Abraham. So I'm pretty sure he Abraham came from northeast of Babylon and moved west into Israel. So I'm you said he was from Samaria. I could be wrong because I'm not exactly sure where Samaria's borders are, but I do know they weren't an empire at that time. So, if you wanted to give a framework as to what year they started, the whole thing with why Abraham is the ultimate patriarch between Judeo Christianity and Islam, and a framework of history versus the scriptures, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So Ur was a city-state of the Sumerian Empire about 4,000 years ago, is what we're given by both Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars to be the most likely time that Abraham would have been about, based off of the scriptures, the chronology, everything like that. And, it's well known, established fact that he's the primary patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam. That's why they're called Abrahamic religions, because all of them serve the God of Abraham. So originally, Abraham and his ancestors were actually polytheistic. This is actually mentioned within the Bible when it said that Abraham came to God and that his forefathers were essentially pagans who worshipped multiple deities, including probably Inanna, not Asherah, because this is before they made their way into the Levantine area. Essentially, they ended up having a nomadic journey from Ur to the land of Canaan and settled down there. The framework for a lot of this has to do with looking at both the history, archaeology, and even also looking within the scriptures for why this plays a huge role into all of these things. Because with Abraham being the prime, almost like the primarch of these three major religions, we have to start there. Because not only does his tribe, but his tribe's beliefs all stem from Abraham.
That's a good point. I would actually just check. So conservatively, I would put Abraham in about 800 BC. I'm sorry, 1800 BC. So keep in mind, Genesis is about 3,400 years wrapped up in 50 chapters, and it blows through like hundreds and thousands of years in a few chapters. So Abraham was about 400 years before the Exodus. You could put Moses at around 400 to 1200 BC. Give it a 200 year time, because during that time there's also the whole collapse of the Bronze Age. So that's a very pivotal point. The Sumerians did have an empire up until 1940 BC, which with the I'm being rough with the timelines. Just I don't want to like start doing math in all the years. So, but yeah, that's good and dandy. So that's interesting you brought up with the tribes and beliefs and all that. One of a point I was harped on was God never gave Abraham a religion. He gave him a contract and he gave him land. He basically made him cattle. And that was the thing. Abraham was a pagan. He followed the religion of whatever they were doing in Samaria. His uncle kept idols, his uncle Lot, that he wanted to break. But here's the thing. Abraham's like 15 chapters down the road. There's been a couple thousand years of events between God and man, and this this man popping out as Samaria. So keep in mind that the whole world was of one language, and everybody knew who God was. And then at the splitting of the Tower of Babel, the languages were split, and this is where it's important to do your diligence in translations and your text sources, because in the Septuagint version, which for the class is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament done and completed in 300 BC. And Septuagint is just a fancy Greek word for 70. And the story goes, 70 rabbis came together in Greece because Alexander the Great made Koine Greek the language of that entire area of land. So anyway, and then we have the Masoretic, which is the oldest text being 1000 AD. Now, we have a lot of discrepancies between this text because Jews do things like they've changed the Old Testament to deny Christ as Messiah, and things have just gotten lost in history. We like the book of Maccabees is recorded, like every single Old Testament Torah book was burned, and they had to basically start from scratch and stuff like that. So, with that being said, Abraham really didn't have God didn't give him any practices other than circumcision. But that's when you have cattle on land, that's a really common practice, and it's a weird thing to signify. And so, with that being said, when you understand the Tower of Babel, you go to the Septuagint and Septuagint and Masoretic. The Masoretic talks about how the people of the Tower of Babel were divided by the number of the sons of Israel. And the issue with that is Israel wasn't born at this time. He's another couple hundred years down the road. When you go to the LXX or the Septuagint and you look at that same verse, it says, and the people were divided by the number of the sons of God. Now, being divided by the number of the sons of man and being divided by a heavenly host are two different things. So when you understand this distinction, and especially like when you go through like the book of Jasher, you see this world, the world was monotheistic. And then after God split the languages, he gave 72 nations over to certain jurisdictions in this heavenly host. And this is where we get like these different world theologies, and kind of kept Abraham to himself as this one tribe. And so, yeah, there's so much more to the history of like how man had a relationship with God in Genesis than just, some of these people were pagan and they've always been pagan, where rather you see God being this singular guy and doing stuff with like a host under him, but also giving jurisdiction to his subordinates and kind of letting man develop in the earth.
Okay. Well, I think it's very important to also look at Abraham and who Abraham himself worshipped, because the God of Abraham changed over the years. You can most especially look at this in Genesis 14 when it talks about Abraham meeting with Melchizedek, who is a worshiper of El, or El Elyon, the Most High. And this is actually quite a different deity than ends up being the tribal deity of the Jews later on, much later on. And like you mentioned, a lot of stuff was lost to history, lost to translation. Many books were burned. But over time, if you like stitch out the entire narrative and the chronology and everything, you realize the original Abrahamites would have most likely been worshippers of El, and then the later Jews and Israelites ended up becoming Yahwistic. And you can see this in the narrative of the Tanakh itself, because it goes from being an Elohist belief system to a Yahwistic, until eventually both of these systems get syncretized to the point where people don't know that there was a difference between El or Yahweh in the original polytheistic sources, where El was actually the top god and Yahweh was one of his sons. And originally El was married to Ashra, many of the Canaanite and Ugaritic belief systems. And then later on, El gets replaced with Yahweh. Yahweh was now seen as the one who was married to Ashra. And then eventually the Yahwists wanted to destroy the divine feminine, and get rid of their sacred prostitution temples to get more power for the patriarchal society that they wanted to live. And so they had to demonize and get rid of all the Ashra belief systems, their idols, their worshippers, their followers. And you see this conflict play throughout the entire whole Old Testament scripture. And that's why there's a lot of demonization of Ashra. Her temples and her belief systems are called the prostitute cults within the Old Testament. And there are many cases where they say the Jews went bad because some of the Jews tried going back to worshiping Ashra, but in reality, what it is more likely is that these Jews or other Israelites actually believed in both Yahweh and Ashra, and then later Yahwists rewrote the narrative to get rid of Ashra. So why? Because it justifies them being able to enslave, rape, kill, and genocide other tribes, and then take their young virgin women as spoils of war.
So were the Canaanites not and Philistines not tribes that were centered around ritual human and child sacrifice? Or like were the Canaanites not breaking out in orgies with the animals?
I mean, they
Like,
might have been.
I mean, I'm asking you a loaded question because that's actually been a pretty interesting uh, discovery in the past 10, 15 years. So, uh, the whole here's the thing: God commanded the Israelis to kill every single man, woman, and child, and animal of certain tribes. I think it was just Canaanites and Philistines. Like, not even the animals were spared. And then other tribes were just, it was just the men, keep the women, shave their heads, and all that. But here's the thing, that's just a demonization on itself out of complete ignorance. Because, like, look, you got to looking at that whole event from the scriptural standpoint. Like, look, if you follow the law to such an extent that if you were out picking up sticks on the day off, you were stoned to death, right? There's something serious about this. Like, they would stone people for they would stone people to death over sexual immorality, whether they be homo. Like, if a man was running around the flowering virgins, like, he was taken outside the city and stoned to death. Like, I don't when there's a record in it about how somebody took a portion of gold that he wasn't supposed to take, and he gets spoils from like all this other land, right? He already has like a bunch of money and a bunch more money coming in on the way, but it's like, it's this gold you set apart for the Lord, and he took a little bit for himself. And bro, they had like the straight cattle system, man. They had God tell a prophet who it was, and that guy was executed. Like, straight up, it's like the fact that they were out there genociding that region, yeah, but they were out there clearing out the land in order to live on because the land was not hospitable. Because according to them, there were giants that made you look like grasshoppers. And if you're a 6 foot man and you feel like a grasshopper next to another man, that man's about 150 foot tall. Looking at the average size of the Middle Eastern locust. Fun fact: it, that's that's also 150 foot is also as tall as the cedars of Lebanon, because the people of the Canaanites and Philistines and other tribes, they're described as being as tall as the cedars of Lebanon. And that's not an exaggeration. I've come to understand that's a legitimate measurement. So, and like, and so let's take a look at the Jewish genocide of giants. Like, what does the rest of the world say about giants? Basically, unanimously, giants across the world tend to be six-fingered, red-haired, and have a disposition for eating people. Like the Native Americans, Hollywood has this thing where they raise their hand and or splay their fingers and go, how? The how part is Hollywood, but the raising the hand and splaying the fingers is real. And it's so they could count your fingers. And if you ask a native why, it's because they're terrified of the six-fingered men who are so tall, so strong, and so fast. They could run alongside a buffalo, rip off a leg, toss the buffalo without breaking its stride. There's a tribe of giants just north of New York, mentioned in the book The History of the Making in New York, where these giants smoked a pipe that was 3 foot long and sturdy enough to beat a horse to death with. And these are the same kind of giants that the natives feared because they got eaten by them. So, Zoo, a rhetorical question, but please answer anyway. You got a tribe of 150-foot giants down the road. They just ate your children. What do you do?
Slay some giants.
There you go. So, I'm not. There's a lot more at play that comes into these lands. And when they took the slaves, they did not take sex slaves, if we're to believe the accounts of what people were stoned to death over. And there's also another aspect to this. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in Levitical law, and usually things are put into law because they're a problem in the first place. Jews, as God describes them, or Yahweh describes them in the Bible, are stubborn, sniff-neck. They're a bit of a nasty people. They've done more to rebel against God than any other group in history. Like, so with that in itself, like, I want to touch on this El and Yahweh thing because I think you make the scholar's mistake in this. So, the Koreans and the Chinese and all that, I'm going to focus on the story of Cain and Abel. So, they have the story of Cain and Abel word for word. It's the same exact thing. But what they do is instead of looking at Cain and Abel like men, they deify them and they make them into gods who they're little gods serving a bigger god, and they have that whole altercation. Other than mixing up whether they were men or gods, the only thing that's different is the flappy noises you make with your mouth. And essentially, what they are is they're the same people. So in that same line, El Elyon is Yahweh, and the Jews have always worshipped that one God that made Adam, right? And there's issues of marriage in here that I'd rather. I'll see if it comes up. But Yahweh isn't like, bro. You don't want other people worshiping you. That's not a good look for you. You want other people worshiping you, and you want the woman on your side. I do believe Yahweh has some kind of a wife. I mean, Jesus has the church as a bride, right? So, but I think it's a whole matter of God going out of his way to keep his wife's name out of your mouth, kind of deal. And so, but Astra, I don't think, I wouldn't think would be the wife of Yahweh on top of that. So, I yield the mic right there.
So I kind of want to touch base again on the El Yahweh transition. So essentially what happened, and you can look at the old Canaanite texts, and it makes it very clear what their belief system was, is that it was polytheistic with a monolateral polytheism, and monotheism is no different. It's just a different branding of that with a different naming. So essentially what happened is you have El, and you have one of his strongest sons was Yahweh out of his 70 children, and El's divine consort was Ashra. And then what ends up happening in Jewish belief system, and we have archaeology, that inscriptions, artifacts that show this, that probably about 3,200 years ago, that the ancient Jews believed that Ashra was the new top dog. El gets replaced by Yahweh, and Yahweh's divine consort is still Ashra. And you can see that with inscriptions that read Yahweh and his wife, or Yahweh and his consort Ashra. And so it actually makes a lot of sense, because if you look at the archaeology and you look at the dates of them and everything, you can see a clear pattern where at these time periods before the Bronze Age collapse, that ancient Israelites, before they slowly became Judahites, essentially they were polytheistic. They did worship both Ashra and Yahweh. They made Yahweh their tribal deity, thus disposing the Abraham's deity, which was El Elyon. And then over time, Yahwism became the dominating force, because there was a lot of internal conflict between Israelites and especially with the Judeans on you should focus more of your attention on worshiping. And essentially what happened, and you'll see this in the Old Testament when they refer to the priests and priestesses of Asherah as the prostitutes of this cult and demonize this, is they were getting rid of Asherah worship in favor of
Okay.
solely Yahwehism.
Let me ask you this. You're a believer in God, right? Is God's original design for it to be man, woman, forever and ever? Like that's your only sex partner? Or is there no such thing as the marriage bed for you?
I believe the hierogamos is very high, and I strive to seek that kind of relationship one day.
Okay. Um, so here's the thing. Like you're trying to glorify temple prostitutes, and I think a temple prostitute is probably the worst thing one could ever be. It's and this comes down to the question of sexual morality. So as far as what I'm getting at, you don't like Yahwehism because it teaches traditional marriage between man and woman, and you don't really have sex outside of it. And you're all about banging out the temple prostitutes under L. Like,
No,
is
Yahwehism
that
actually doesn't teach traditional marriage. That's why one thing I did really want to make a comment about what you said earlier. It's categorically untrue, even within your scripture, that the Judahites didn't use these women as concubines, because it was actually in the Tanakh legal to have a concubine. The traditional marriage isn't a concept that gets solidified into and until later on with Christianity. In old school Judaism, that's why David had 7, 8 wives. Solomon had countless wives and countless concubines. The elite males of those societies were allowed to purchase these young women or have them as spoils of war, depending on their status as a warrior and a leader within the tribal community, and have them as sex slaves. That's very clear that that was part of the legal belief system of the ancient Jews. And that was
um,
justified and claimed by Yahweh. Yahweh told them they could do this.
it's not. This is a disregarding of what the actual scriptures state, and it and omitting details from the court. So what between Isaac had 3 wives, or Israel had 3 wives, right? He only loved Rebecca though. He like bro when he got that first wife. What's her name? I might be mixing up the names too. But his first wife, Rachel, he didn't even want her, bro. He was like, "What's this, bro? You're ripping me off." And then yeah, he he got 2 wives he didn't want. With David, he only loved Bathsheba. The one who got the throne came from the woman he loved the most. Uh, its original design is Adam and Eve. Like yeah, like so you're right. There's a thing with what you calls it with Christianity because Jesus came and rectified that. People asked him about divorce, and or Pharisees asked him about divorce because they're about the traditional marriage. And Jesus told them, it's like, look, you're allowed to get divorced because your hearts are hard. You got to go back to the beginning because it was not so. Adam and Eve were cleaved unto one flesh. When you start adding other people, you start making things in the one flesh that shouldn't be one flesh. And so they do teach chastity across the board. Like just because people have concubines doesn't mean it's desirable. The Song of Solomon is monogamous, not polyamorous. And Hosea is a book about monogamy, about a faithful marriage. Hades and Persephone is a monogamous faithful marriage, probably one of the best examples of marriage I've ever seen because she chose to stay by her man in the conditions of death. Like it's stuff like that. And so even across the board, you look at other places in the world, it's actually always been traditionally man and woman. Like you don't really have like promiscuity in India. They teach a traditional marriage. That you might have your Hindu sects, with prostitutes, but like it, and at least in like real Vedic literature, like sex outside of marriage is unfaithful because the idea of it is abusing the power to make life outside of the confines of the marriage bed. It takes two to tango, man. Like having a temple prostitute is abuse of like the womb and where life comes in and the whole process with it, man.
Well,
It's like
I'm
you
glad.
don't throw seeds into a dumpster.
Well, I'm glad
Sorry, I'm done.
you keep bringing up the concept of traditional marriage, because what you define as the concept of traditional marriage only existed after really the 1500s in Western civilization. Before then, marriage was solely a tool used by the elites for the sake of keeping their bloodlines, part of the bloodline game. And it wasn't until about the early 1520s, I want to say, that the Vatican actually started encouraging people to get married and encouraged it as an institution. Even then, they only did that so that they could have more control over the kings and queens and the nobility of Europe. It was never done for the sake of, God and what God intended. No, it was done politically. And then Protestant Reformation, which came afterwards, took that concept and redefined what the traditional marriage was based off their interpretation of the New Testament. Obviously, they didn't base it off a lot of the concepts of the Old Testament, because in the legalism presented in the Torah, these men were actually allowed to be polygamous if they were high ranking, high status, just like David, just like Solomon, just like countless other people within the henotheistic belief system that they had. In fact, what's really interesting is if you look at the Ashkenazi Jews and you do genetic testing, you'll find that there's a paternal bottlenecking that went on early in their bloodlines. And that's why genetically we have proof that there was some sort of polygamy or polyamory going on, where a few men end up being the primary progenitors of an entire ethnic group of people, an entire ethnic line of ethnic Jews.
So I'm familiar with the Ashkenazi stuff. Well, actually, I've never heard of that. I've heard some stuff about their DNA and how they're not Jews, but I've never heard of whole bottlenecking into a few patriarchal figures. As far as like, look, there's a difference between God allowing something and it being allowed. Like across the board, and I'm pretty sure you said the Tanakh. There's no clause that allows high-ranking men to have a concubine unless you want to post that scripture in Torah. Um, and but God allowing David to have concubines is different than uh, there being a rule that says anyone who's of a high rank is allowed to. And again, bro, like you're making very broad generalizations across 3,400 years of how many years? Across 1,800 years of literature, 1,400 years. No, Book of Job was before Torah. Yeah, over 1,000 years of literature. You're making broad generalizations over these books, and like just these individual books. The very basis of them prove you wrong. Like the Book of Ruth is about a woman pursuing a man, and this man doesn't have a wife, and his eyes are only for Ruth because he sees what kind of a woman she is. Like, and the whole premise of that is people were engaged in a monogamous marriage, like beforehand. Like this guy died, and this woman has to like figure out whether she's going to go back, or what she's going to do. She's going to go back to Israel and like what to do with her daughters. Tells them to go back to the land of the Moabs. So, like, there's so many different examples of traditional monogamous marriage, like, or just rather a wife being favored highly than the others. But that's always the thing with favorites. Like, yeah, David had 700 wives again, but Bathsheba was his favorite. With the book of Esther, there was a Persian king. I believe in Persia, he only had, at least this king only had one bride, because it doesn't really mention his concubines. And he divorces his first wife, because she pissed him off and had a contest to have a new wife. Like, this whole idea of a traditional monogamous marriage being invented in the 1500s it's ludicrous to the entirety of history across humankind, because that's like even from a completely secular standpoint, like that's always been a thing. Like, yeah, you've had a few people who've had more, but that's to look at a small substrate and say it applies to the average to the bottom. It's not how it works.
So on that point, there's nothing new under the sun, and just as back then, it still applies even to this day. Wealthy men with a lot of influence and resources are going to have the most share of the women. You look at your Dan Belzar. I mean, so essentially, David was like the Dan Belzar of his day. This is something that is basically a worldwide phenomena across many tribes, where the high status males were basically allowed to have multiple wives, whereas the layman, the commoner, they would at most be able to have one wife if they were lucky. Once again, the women gravitated towards the wealth and influence. This concept is referred to as hypergamy, and it's something that has existed across all of human socialization. Um, Furthermore, in the Torah, it specifically says that they are legally allowed to do this by their laws, by their
I need
belief
you to
system.
post a verse in the Torah before you state that.
Post a verse on what?
Post a verse on how people are allowed to have concubines from the Torah. You can't sit there and make that claim and not post a scripture at this point, because I'm contesting that that's not there.
Then prove to me.
Either he cut out or I cut out.
Yeah, we lost you, Zoo.
Okay, what I am saying is, where does God or Yahweh specifically outlaw concubines in the Torah or the Tanakh? It's never once stated. What is stated is that basically God turns a blind eye to the fact that David has 8 or 9 wives, and Solomon's allowed to have 300 wives and 700 concubines. So
I'm gonna correct you right there. God didn't turn a blind eye to it. God actually orchestrated that and said he would do that. Just I wanted to set the record straight there. I thought you would appreciate that. um, so I mean, here's the thing. The men in these books are men who have hearts. So I think there's a disregard for their hearts going on right now, because again, Israel, he really didn't care for, or Jacob, he really didn't care for those two other wives. He loved Rebecca. David, he didn't care for any of those wives. He didn't care for any of those concubines. He only loved Bathsheba. Solomon got the throne. Like it's a shame that they've succumbed to their flesh. But when you sit down and you look at their heart, like Abraham didn't have multiple wives. He had Sarah. He didn't want to bang it out with anyone else. Like, it's like, what about Warren Buffett, man? He's like one of the richest, most successful men, man. I'm pretty sure he's only had a one and only. Like, didn't he marry his high school sweetheart? Like, you're like again, you're taking a small substrate of men who are hyper successful, and then you're also taking another substrate from them, and those are the ones who are promiscuous. Because if you look at that power structure, it's not all one way or the other. There's a lot of people who are just they're in chastity, right? There are other people who are promiscuous, like Elon Musk. There are other people who are in a one and only, like Warren Buffett. It's and to sit there and make a bold generalization off, like, and with hyper successful men, they're also different from each other across the board. Like, you'll pick up three and you'll have three different, like, they're not going to follow any pattern of average because they're at the top. So I don't know. It's just, and when you read through those scriptures, you can see it on David and you can see it on Jacob. And anybody with multiple wives in the scripture, it's pretty obvious which one they love the most, and they really wouldn't care if the other wives died. Like, that was a little harsh, maybe more misworded, but you get the point.
Okay, so I did find the scripture. So here's, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, starting in verse 10. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her to your house, she shall serve you head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and she will remain in your house and lament her father and her mother a full month. And after that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. By the way, that means in the Old Testament, in the Torah, that God tells them that they can, against the woman's will, marry the women of tribes that they conquered.
Let me pull this up in a couple of versions here. Okay. I like how you left out the last part, by the way. Like, there's a couple of things you left out in here that wasn't cool, man. Okay, so take captives, right? You shall desire to take for your wife, and you shall bring her home to your house, and she's got to shave her head and rip or cut her nails, right? That's not attractive, man. Like, you realize that, like, that whole I know it's worded differently in English, but that whole process involves making the woman as ugly as possible, right? And then you give her a month to mourn. Okay.
So they
So,
humiliate
and
her.
hang on, wait. Now after that, you try before you buy. If you don't want her as your wife after she's ugly and after she's done mourning, then you don't want her. But you're not allowed you can't do anything to her because at the end it says you mistreated her. I want you to realize that that whole act in itself of going into her and trying before you're buying, that's an act of humiliation and shame. Like,
As is killing her entire tribe, forcing her to shave her hair, forcing her to cut her nails.
yeah, guess what? Her dad was busy sacrificing babies and the mom was cheering her on. Yeah, the young woman's innocent, so let's go ahead and not visit the crimes of her father upon her head. Like, yeah, they genocided maniacs, according to their record, to be fair.
Well, I mean, they still believe this. That's why in the official 613 mitzvot, they actually explicitly say that they are on a mission to kill all of the Canaanites and their descendants. In fact, some Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, use this as justification for killing Palestinians who they believe to be the descendants of these Canaanites.
Um, well, I mean, I'm not. I don't care about fans anyway. So the word Palestine in itself, I think it literally means belonging to the Philistines, which is which isn't true. God gave that, like, the actual God gave that land to people, and as far as I can tell, the actual people have never been into that land fully. So, how do I want to put this? Sorry, can
So
you
here's
repeat
another
your
one.
last couple of phrases?
Here's another one, starting in verse 15 of the same chapter. If a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and unloved have borne him children, if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the first fruits of his strength, the right of the firstborn person. So what is essentially being coded as law, because Deuteronomy means the second law, are laws on how you should act in a polygamous arrangement.
And that's fine. But here's the thing. So this first the first verse you linked, this is not a concubine. This is a wife. This is like a wife, right? And on the second part, it's like, yeah, polygamy was a thing because uh, the majority of people who die prematurely are men, and the women get left behind. And so they don't have a lot of options other than to remarry. So, and that's the thing. Like, look, Lot, like the reason why Lot married all his daughters off to Jacob was because Jacob was a man who was going to live and who was going to provide for Lot's genealogy, or to further his bloodline and provide his daughter safety. So that, like, bro, that's like the mindset. Like anybody could die. So like, what can I do to like? And you have five daughters. Like if you can, well, there's putting all your eggs in one basket, but there's also putting all your eggs in a safe. So I don't know. It's yeah, these verses aren't supporting of the concubine. I'm not disputing that they have polygamy and they have practices based around polygamy. Like, look, man, in Christianity in the New Testament, you're not allowed to get divorced. You're explicitly forbidden. But if you do it, you're given guidelines on how to do it. So it's like what a lot of rules are is, especially like the Levitical and Deuteronomy stuff, are stuff that were problems in this are in the area and even in the people. Like the reason why God had to tell the Israelis to don't screw animals is because they've been uh they're in the Middle East and that's just something that people do. And so that was like a widespread problem. So they did in Leviticus. And same thing with like the prostitution and the whoredom. Like there's a scripture that like that talks about a man or its parents, and they take their son and they throw him to the people in the village, and they say, "Our son is a drunk and a whoremonger, and has done nothing good in his life, but only evil. Take him outside and stone him to death." Like that, I don't know. It's morally right, and like here's another aspect of this. Like your average citizen had power to enact capital punishment. They call it the scepter, and it's like one of it's it's just actually something amazing to look at with a government in relation with its people. Like
So
if
here's another couple laws.
go ahead.
So if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all of his days. So essentially, if a guy really wants to, in this old society, he could have raped a virgin and forced her to be his wife for the rest of his life against her will, because women are treated as property as a result of Ashura worship being demonized later on.
There's scripture in that book that will make woman like what makes a woman inheritor of the property if there's no men. Like it's there are women judges in the book of Judges. Like Deborah is a judge. There's a woman who like straight up kills a king in Israel. Like you talk about this whole patriarchal matriarchal thing. No, it's in the Bible. It's men and women working together. And yeah, the man's bigger and stronger. So when you're carving a warpath, you obviously the jobs are different, right? And being a leader doesn't mean you're not equal. And just because like you throw around the word patriarchal like some kind of feminist, and I don't mean to uh, like character center you, but like what do you even mean like patriarchal? Like it is a feminist buzzword to kind of just dump on this idea that men are evil or having masculinity is bad. Like and it it's hard to see past your arguments when you are phrase you seem to be phrasing it like this. Like, who do you want to lead you into battle, a man or a woman? Most likely a
So a
man.
patriarch. So
Go ahead.
literally, this is the definition of patriarchy: is a system that is ruled and where the majority of the authority and control goes into the patriarchs. And it just so happens that in Abrahamic belief systems, this is very paramount. This is why Abraham is such a powerful figure, because he's the prime patriarch. And so even within these legal systems, women are only a lot of times young women could only be protected basically by their father. So earlier on, if in one of the Deuteronomy laws, it talks about what happens if a man misspeaks about a woman that he's married to. And essentially, she's only protected if she is a daughter of Israel by her father. And her father takes this man to the elders. And the elders are going to be the prime spiritual figures and legal figures of that society. And so I
Let's go
bring
ahead
that.
and post this verse. You had the verse number, or
Oh, yeah. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 13. So basically, here's how it reads. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and then hates her and accuses her of misconduct and brings a bad name upon her, I took this woman, and when I came near her, I did not find in her evidence of virginity. Then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. And the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man to marry. He hates her. And behold, um, uh, and behold, he has accused her of misconduct, saying, I did not find in your daughter evidence of virginity, and yet this is the evidence of the daughter's virginity, and shall spread the cloak before the elders of the city. Now, this only applies to women who are born of Israelites. This does not apply to women who were captured by other Canaanite tribes or rival tribes. Those women had no rights. Those women were forced to marry their captors.
I look at the Book of Ruth, and I can only think that's wrong. Like, here's the thing: if you're married into it, you become a bride of Israel. Like, it's if this thing be true and it tokens of virgin, and they shall bring out the damsels to the door of the father's house, and the men in the city shall stone her with stone, because she wrought folly in Israel to play the whore in her father's house, so that to put evil away from you.
So, I mean, I'm glad you
Okay,
did bring that up.
I would go ahead and state that I realize it says version of Israel, but like Ruth's a Moabite woman, and she's married into Israel. She what's her name? Boaz. From what I see in other parts of the scripture, if you marry an Israeli man, you're taken into Israel. Like, it was the same thing with the prostitute Rahab. It's like, bro, like, there are Jews who love their, like, look, Gomer in the book of Hosea. Like, there's there's a story about a God telling a man to marry a prostitute and then just love her and only her, and like go out of your way. Like, she runs the whore. She cheats on him, spends all this money, racks up a bunch of debt, and she gets sold into slavery. And after years of doing this, like spending money on lavish oils, living a good life, and getting dick down, she's getting sold into slavery butt naked to cover the price of her debt. So Hosea comes around and buys her back for a portion of silver and barley and wheat. And the idea is that he didn't have enough silver to cover her debt, so he went hungry to buy her back. Like, and I need to confirm this, but I'm reasonably sure Gomer's a Gentile. And if Gomer is a Gentile, then this defeats the whole argument. Let me double check this.
But they only have rights if they are married to a Jewish man or an Israeli man. As soon as they are not married to one, they have no rights. Even these women back in their day, based off of what legal system that they had.
I mean, here's the thing: if you're a woman in the Middle East during this time, what kind of life do you really have? To be honest, like it's not like they can go start a career in publishing. Like it's like you can either work the field, you can mill, you can tailor, you can fish, you can cut fish, you can cook, you can clean, but you got to do something in the village. Like the early the early Jews, they made all the priests and the religious figures have a trade because they thought of it as stealing if you just ran the temple without contributing something else uh, like harvesting of plants or tailoring, et cetera, like stuff like that. You're required to have a trade as a rabbi. So, and yeah, there's, I don't know. Hang on, let me, Gomer. And yeah, here's another thing. Like the whole thing with the Levitical law, it only applies to a bunch of Jews in the Middle East living in that land. That law will never apply to a Greek government. God will never hold the Greek government to that standard. So that's like another key point. Like, yeah, these rules only have weight within a certain amount of borders. And there's stuff like, bro, if you blaspheme in that land, you're killed, and that makes sense. Like if I'm over the border, that law doesn't apply to me. If I'm up in Russia and I'm saying bad stuff about Yahweh, it's like why should they care?
So essentially, what I've been getting at though, and staying with a centralized theme on this, is that um, I brought all of these things up to provide evidence, and I've successfully done so, that in old Jewish belief systems and their court systems, that they were legally allowed to be polygamous, and a set of guidelines for how they could do it, and a set of guidelines for how they can even obtain marriage. They're none of these, and like you said, and like you, I guess, essentially receded to or succeeded to it say, is that these don't apply to today's day and age because we live in a completely different system. And as such, um, what is said in the Old Testament no longer applies because we live in a new world order, a different world order than what they lived in. However, I bring this up because it is important to look at the historical context and acknowledge what happened and how these women's lives were actually ran and how they were treated. And essentially, what you see is that when Yahwism took a hold and they began demonizing women, also their treatment of women completely changed. Their treatment of women became their property, their spoils of war, and also that you could get concubines. And that was a reality of Israelite tribalism probably at least 3,000 years ago.
Again, you could not have concubines. We went over that scripture. It was a wife, and it was a tribe before you. It wasn't a rape. It wasn't. She was like sex trafficked and made into being a slave. What it talks about what she went through is a humiliation, and I want you to like understand something that the person who actually goes and practices this understands that he reads that part where he's doing a really awful thing to her. Like, do you like does that seem lost to you that the person who would practice that would read that and that thought might come across their head? Like there are things that are spoken of like they're wrong. God lets them work through it, but they're still wrong. Like, and just because there's a clause around it or a way to work around the situation doesn't mean it's right. And doesn't mean that the authorship of the book makes it right either. And so the whole thing with the Queen of Heaven worship. So we talked about Jeremiah and that recently. So Jeremiah wrote against the worshiping of the Queen of Babylon, or sorry, Queen of Heaven. And here's the thing: Astro worship really popped up in what you said was the 8th century BC as a revival. But what it really was It was just a rebellion and a straying away from the true God. And like it was that kind of stuff that led to the Babylonian captivity and why they were exiled because they started worshiping idols. Like the whole thing, like, yeah, they have the Ark of the Covenant that like literally carries the presence of God, and but nobody actually sits down and like worshipped it. They didn't worship the ark with it. Like there are idols that fell before the ark, but they weren't falling before the ark. They were falling before God. Like the whole thing with astro worship, it's just low key idol worship. And when you start using an exterior process to get closer to God, rather than make it an interior process to get closer with God, you're straying away. Which is why, like, bro, at the peak of like Jeremiah, after worship got reintroduced, bro, the Israelis were doing some really naughty stuff. Like it is when you get into that book, it is basically a bunch of Jews trying to do right by God, and then but sacrificing a couple children on the way. They consistently fell to Moloch worship and the practices of the Canaanites. Like it's and not only that, they follow the practices of the pagan Greeks and uh, for they let a pig. Well, they didn't let the pig sacrifice really set them off because even though every Torah was destroyed, they still knew enough to know that you don't sacrifice a pig in the temple. But it's stuff like that, and not only that, the book itself is it's consistent, and the same guy in Genesis is the same guy in the New Testament. Because like the whole thing with the heart of God behind these scriptures, it's man and woman, and then woman lost her way, and then the man has to go out and get her back, and the man goes through the heartbreak to get her back, and he has to kill a dragon, and he has to die and come back from the dead in order to save his bride. Like the whore gets redeemed. Like the Bible talks about women who are legitimately mistreated, right? And who not only that mistreat themselves in living certain lifestyles, and in the end, they're raised up and they're liberated from slavery. Like that's the whole point of Gomer. She's about to live a hard life, or she's about to do hard labor as a slave, and she's redeemed because out of her bad choices, which is a lot better than most of us deserve.
Wait, Gomer's a dude's name.
Gomer is not a girl's name. It is the name of a woman in the Old Testament.
Okay. Well, what I was getting at is what you are defining as traditional marriage wasn't even traditional to the Israelites at any point in their ancient history. Um, Furthermore, these are concepts that changed over time, and what you call traditional marriage is based off of a lot of which based off of beliefs in the 1600s. They're not one to one with how a lot of these people lived back in ancient times. There were some people who were in monogamous relationships, but usually those were people of the lower castes. They did it for the sake of survival. Whereas, once again, the higher males would be able to do what they want. They'd have more leeway, they'd have more leverage in terms of resources, social status, and influence within the tribal communities, and would be able to have multiple wives. That's how the whole concept of concubine came to be, is that they could buy a concubine who was a sex slave from a slave trader and keep them as sexual worship objects. And this was allowed in the old Jewish belief system during the times of David and Solomon. What you also see, and it was really, really important, this is really important, that the God throughout the Bible is not the same God of Abraham. And this is where things get really messed up because El, who was a Canaanite deity, gets replaced with Yahweh, who is another Canaanite deity. And Abraham was a traveler and settler to the land of Canaan who adopted the gods of his neighbors. He did not find El in Ur. He completely got rid of all of the gods he believed in from his home area in Ur, and then transplanted himself into a new area and began adopting one of their gods, El, who is completely different from Yahweh. In fact, this is basically proven early on in Deuteronomy. There's a very famous verse in one of the first couple chapters. I don't remember if it's chapter 4 or chapter 6, essentially showing that El and Yahweh are completely different entities. And it was
You're gonna
only
have
later
to
on.
you're gonna have to go ahead and give me the exact verse.
All right, give me a sec. I'll have to look it up.
I'll just point out there is a channel where verses to this effect are compiled. Both the Ancient Order of Melchizedek and the Gospel of El channel contain many sources on this particular subject, and I really appreciate it. I just want to jump in and say I really appreciate you being here, Doug, and sharing your knowledge. And Zoo, this is fantastic, and we can break this down also into a series of podcasts if you guys want. I'm not saying you're out of time by any means. I'm just saying this is great content, and I'd love to hear more of it.
There's something else you're also drastically missing. So the Levites are arguably the highest class because one, they're the priesthood. Two, they deal with all the temple gold, the temple sacrifices. They get the best cut of meats. So it's funny because in order to be a priest, you're actually required to be married to one woman, and you're not allowed to have any more women than that. As far as like the other scriptures, it's like, yeah, other people had we're basically talking in circles at this point between what's being allowed and what's not. But the whole thing within itself, it's I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. Can you like repeat or finish what you're saying and repeat a few points before that?
Yeah, I can. Essentially, what I was distinguishing is that there was two different entities who ended up being secretized later on by Yahwists to retain portions of the narrative. And originally, the God of Abraham was El, and later on, it was actually the Yahwists who took over and became the main theocratic leaders of the Judahites or Judeans. And during the Second Temple period, after leaving Babylon and learning and incorporating a lot of things they learned from Babylonian belief systems, they started basically going through and restarting their religion. And by doing so, they had to work with their old sources passed on to them from oral stories and some texts from their ancestors. And what they did is they essentially they transplanted Marduk worship into Yahweh worship, and they turned Yahweh and El and all the other names of God into one singular entity, whereas prior to all of this, they were actually very polytheistic. They actually got the idea from their exile of Babylon because Marduk was seen as a very, very powerful god of all gods. And they got really jealous about this because Marduk made their belief system look like archaic and weak, and their god looked like piss poor in comparison. And so to get revenge on the Babylonians, who they still hate to this day, that's why Israelites hate the Iraqis. They basically took a lot of the ideas of Marduk worship and incorporated it into their Second Temple period scriptures and beliefs.
Okay. Name two ideas that go into Marduk worship that were taken from there and put into Yahweh worship.
Oh, that's really simple. Having multiple names and epithets, expanding to your chief deity, having one supreme chief deity above all, who's a male, an unmarried male. There's two right there.
Okay, so you're telling me that that wasn't the case in Psalms then, like, because here's the thing, like the Book of Psalms beats the Babylonian captivity by a couple hundred years, and everything David wrote it is what was already there before Marduk. Like you're on kind of like the Zeitgeist tier thing where you say like stuff like the ancient Israelis never had an idea of a traditional marriage, but like when you look through the testimony of Adam and like the testament of the 12 patriarchs and like the really old Jewish writings that it's man and woman. It's one on one. Like it's so. Here's the other aspect of this. Like, um, talking about how after Christ the laws of Israel no longer apply. But and here's the thing: before Moses, the law of Leviticus never applied either. Like there's and this other thing. So God called, like Yahweh God called Abraham out of Ur. And so that's pretty much clear scripture. So you managed to do some hearsay and say like, well, that never happened. He just left and went and picked up the religion in the area and said that scripture in Deuteronomy proves that. And I'm a I'm a bit lost as to how you made that assertion. And maybe I'll see here in a minute. But like, look, the God of
It's in the chat.
Abraham, the God of Abraham, as far as I've been able to tell, is a God that's been concerned with bringing dead things back to life because they were wrongfully killed. And that's pretty much been the consistent theme of the Bible from start to finish, from Genesis to Revelation, is resurrection and redemption from being dead in ways that are dead. And so, I don't know, I don't feel like anything that was brought up in the scripture was honest to the times or what it's really talking about. And again, there's nothing in the Old Testament that permits a concubine. There's a permission for a second wife, but bro, that's not like you're going to tell me you're going to look at that phrasing and you're going to tell me men like wanted to do that, because there are men who did do that, but did they want to do that?
Yeah, probably if they were obsessed with their legacy. I mean, that would be a very strong reason why you'd want to have multiple wives and expand your legacy by your seed, which is something they genuinely believed in. Maybe not so much nowadays when men don't have much responsibility, and this might seem like a foreign concept, but once upon a time there were men ambitious enough to want to do this.
But yeah, people don't think about legacy anymore, what they're leaving behind on the earth, and like what their kids are going to do and their kids are going to do. That's a very good point. We don't have that these days, and there are reasons why men did stuff, but like, bro, are you going to tell me that the Old Testament looks as concubines or a plethora of wives as a favorable situation or a unfavorable situation? And we'll boil it down like that.
Well, I mean, it was very favorable to the Israelites. I mean, that's how the genesis of the entire tribe of tribes began, was by one person who had multiple wives, and not just their wives, but also their maids. Those maids were property of Jacob, who became Israel. So he had four wives, two of which he inherited as servants who had no permission. They were just told, "Hey, by the way, because you serve me as my master is my husband. He's also your master. Therefore, he's your husband, essentially."
So are you telling, like, okay, it was three wives, none of them were handmaidens or slaves. They were all daughters of Lot. And again, you bring this up, and I have to keep harping on this point. Jacob didn't want Rebecca, or he didn't want the other one. I think he wanted Rachel. Like I said, I'm going to get the names mixed up, but he only wanted one. He didn't really care about the other two. When he got the other two, before he got the one he wanted, bro, he felt like he was ripped off. Like he was spending time with the wrong person. Like, do you get that? Like, have you ever been with a woman you really didn't want to be with, but you were still with because of circumstances and pressure from the outside and just straight manipulation and trickery? Like, I'm sure you have. You're a good-looking guy.
So I just want to clarify, only two of the women of his four wives were Laban's daughters, and that would be Rebecca and Leah. The other two wives he had, because he had four wives in total that he progenerated, that had 12 children by him. Two of them were handmaidens. One was a handmaiden to Rachel, and the other was a handmaiden to Leah. Laban didn't have a third daughter. He only had two daughters.
He, you know what? You're right. I stand corrected. Yeah. He didn't want Leah, he wanted Rachel. Either way, the point still stands. Like, let me ask you something. If you're talking about hearts and all that, do you think Jacob wanted one wife or four wives?
I mean, I think Jacob really wanted four wives. I think Jacob was that rare individual who wanted to leave a legacy behind on this in this world. And I think Jacob genuinely believed that he was doing this for his tribal deity. I believe he's sincere in that, and he saw these women as tools by which he can spawn nations of people eventually. And he, by doing so, he would honor his forefathers, Isaac and Abraham.
Uh, I'd have to. Well, there's aspects of that. He put up with what he had. He, I mean, he really didn't want it though, man. I'll sit here and tell you that occasionally I can see into people's hearts, and this is like one of those times. I'll go ahead and play that card right here. Jacob did not care for these other women. As for wives. Like I would imagine he cared about them like same way you like care about your sister raising her kids. But yeah,
Well,
like
essentially,
because you have
we're in
to.
agreement because what I was saying is that he used these women as a tool, except for Rachel. He loved Rachel. The other three he did not love. They were nothing more than objects and tools by which to bring people into this world to spread his belief system and his legacy. Nothing more but tools
I
and something he
disagree
put
with
up with.
that wholeheartedly. He did not have this nefarious thing like, well, I'm gonna bang out these women so other people believe in the same God as me. It's like no, man. He gave them children because they were in a marriage with him and they were about to have a life. So if they wanted something, he ultimately gave them something to love. Like that's as much as it is to say like sometimes a baby fixes a lot of problems.
Well,
Like
Jacob is definitely known as a trickster character. In fact, that's how he inherits his blessing from Isaac. In fact, in
he
Old
doesn't
Hebrew,
trick
yeah,
that
I mean,
his mom did
he
that, not
literally
him.
did. He did trick. He did trick his father into by dressing up as his brother Esau. Esau was clearly the favorite because Esau was a man's man, and Jacob was like kind of a little fucking bitch in comparison.
Um, no, that's still wrong. His mom tricked Abraham, not Jacob.
Jacob
That
literally was the one who did the tricking. His mom had the idea. Jacob was the one who actually got goat's hair and put it on himself to trick his father, who was going blind and becoming senile. To say otherwise is to try saying that Jacob had no hand in it. In fact, Jacob had a very direct hand in it.
here's the crux of the issue. Soldier takes the hill. Who gets the credit? The soldier or the general? The
I
general who
mean, this
told him to
isn't
do it.
about credit. This is
Like,
about responsibility.
yeah, and here's the thing. He did what he did under the direction of his mother. If his mom kept his mouth shut or kept her mouth shut, Joseph wouldn't have done that. I'm sorry, Jacob wouldn't have done that.
I mean, there's a old saying that there's a reason why Jacob in Old Hebrew sounds something a lot like deceiver. It's well known that Jacob was a trickster character and he was quite cunning. There are many times when he does tricking. In fact, not only Jacob, but I think one of his sons tricks the same king. Yeah. No, Jacob tricks the same guy that Isaac tricked, one of the kings, into letting him live by saying that his wife is his daughter. I might be getting characters mixed up here.
Um, yeah, you are getting characters mixed up. That story of Jacob isn't in the scripture. Um, I don't even think there's a story like that where Jacob tricks a king with. Here's the thing: it's not even a trick. Like here's the whole thing with Abraham. Like, because you're talking about Abraham and Sarah. So here's like something. Even at 90 years old, Sarah was smoking hot, right? So much so to the point where Abraham feared for his life that if they knew that she was his wife, they would just kill him and take her to wife. Like 90-year-old barren woman, think about that. So, what should calls it? So, and he feared for his life. So, king comes up, it's like, oh, well, that's my brother. It's like, okay, here's a dowry. I'm gonna marry her. And then God visits him in it, or God visits that king in a dream. I think it's King Abimelech or something. And maybe, but he visits him in a dream, and he says, what are you doing with that woman?" It's like, "What do you mean? That's like that was her, or that was a sister. Like, I just bought a wife. Like, no, they're married, and I'm doing something with that guy. So, uh, give her back." And then the king, he begs and he prays in his dreams, like, "God, I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't mean to do this. I didn't know that was his wife. It's like, would you destroy? Like, I didn't do anything either. Like, would you destroy my whole nation for my adultery and or adultery that I didn't do?" And so it's interesting because this king, he tied his sexual morality with the fate of his nation. Like like his personal life, it was or would ultimately or could lead to the destruction of the people under him. And that's the way he's viewing it. And God tells him, "It's like, no, I came to you in this dream to stop you from doing it. Just give her back and give him some more stuff, and then send him on his merry way." And that's the thing. And there was, I mean, you can consider that a trick, but it was a trick not to deceive people in a playful way, but like, hey, these people will straight up kill me because you're smoking hot.
Yeah, I was getting it confused. I'll concede on that. I was thinking of Isaac and Abraham. They both tricked the same king because their wives were seen as very beautiful, and this king wanted them, or not just this king, but the royal people within his tribal court wanted these women. But really, I guess what I've kind of been getting at with rounding about what's going on with Jacob is that there is a narrative within the core narrative of the Torah, within the Tanakh, within the Bible, that Jacob must use these women as tools to bring forth nations. Well, three of them. One of them he genuinely loves. The other three are absolutely unloved. What this shows is that there are. This would be way before Jewish legalism, but this is a case when God directly permits and encourages polygamy, or should I say, either Yahweh or El. Not entirely sure.
I would
Not entirely sure who Jacob believed in as God.
I would state encourage is a bit of a gross overtone. Allowed and directed, that's fine. Hang on. Let me see. Let me. I should know this because I did get the name of the king right. I didn't know Isaac did stuff with that king. Hang on.
So here's a good one. Shogun posted this in general chat. I'll just read this out. This is from Deuteronomy. When the Most High, Elion, or El Elyon, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of divine beings. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, and his allotted heritage, which shows that Jacob is a bloodline of Yahweh. But Yahweh is still the top dog in this belief system. They are
Oh, bro,
definitely separate entities.
he didn't trick this king. Oh man, yeah. This isn't a trickster thing or like a joker or deception. Like, yeah, Isaac and Jacob are different people. It goes Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, who's Israel. So, um, whatchamacallit? Oh, so Isaac had the same problem Abraham had. His wife was smoking hot, so people would kill her for him, or to kill him for her. And so he told him that she was his sister. And so, yeah, it was the same king, and it was the same problem. And so what he did was like, because he's on a mission from God. Hang on, it's Genesis 26. Um, in verse 10, it says, "And Abimelech said, And what is thou hast done unto us? One of the people might lightly have wine with thy wife, and thou shouldest have brought guiltiness upon us." My roommate's home. Anyway, and Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He that toucheth this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. And so here's the thing. I want you to keep in mind that one of the very first things in this book, in Genesis, is protecting the marriage. Because, hang on, let me double check how many wives Isaac had.
Hey, do you have any response
Um,
for that reverse that
I'm also going
Logan
to suggest that we start making some closing arguments and call this a chapter. And if you guys are willing to revisit it or continue it in the future, that'd be great. And Doug, hopefully you'll
I'll
take
tell you in
some
a
time
minute.
in the future to listen to some of the episodes we've done in the past on similar related topics, as this is an ongoing project of the server, and you've contributed a lot to it. So I'm grateful. Why don't you guys start making some working towards some closing arguments? No rush, right?
I'll,
But just
I'll go
would you
ahead
like to
and
go first, Doug?
I'll go with what I was saying and make that as a closing argument. Yeah. So Isaac had one wife, Rebecca. So Genesis 26, that thing, that's um. So keep in mind, Abimelech had a direct conversation with God about adultery. Now, keep in mind, like there's this thing called the Noahide laws, and the Noahide laws are like after flood, before the Torah, and they have the same thing. Like, don't have idols, don't commit adultery, like don't lie, don't eat an animal alive. So in the same way, and so in Genesis 20, or in the 20s, when you have Abraham, Isaac dealing with the king of the Philistines, Abimelech, he views crime or adultery as a crime against God and something that his nation be destroyed over. So, and with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca, both two monogamous people, and ultimately the highest protection was shown to the monogamous relationships. Where versus in these polygamous relationships, they're either full of drama, they end horribly. Like, look at David's death. David died basically of AIDS and had to have a woman he didn't even know, who wasn't Bathsheba, comforting him. At what point do we look at the lessons and what the Bible states and really accept what they're saying? Because there's things that they're allowed in the Bible, but the fates of such actions are tend to lead to misery.
Okay, I'll end my closing argument by reiterating what my thesis essentially is that over time, the story and narrative has changed multiple times. There's no actual internal consistency that goes on between, old school Judaism to modern day Protestantism. I've definitely demonstrated this by pointing out how the quote unquote modern interpretation of traditional marriage didn't actually follow how the ancient Jews lived or their legal systems or their beliefs. It's actually quite different. It's a different time and different place. So that's absolutely understandable because things change over time. Ultimately, also, I'd like to point out that their even their tribal deity changed over time. And it's kind of funny that most Christians or Muslims or Jews don't see this, and that this is actually explicitly within the Old Testament, within Deuteronomy. So essentially, what you had was originally Abraham came from Ur and adopted one of the gods, a polytheistic
You still never
deity.
posted that verse. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you did
It's
not post that
it's
verse in
in.
Deuteronomy.
I read it out loud. It was in chat.
Is it in the
Anyways,
general chat or
yeah,
the voice text chat?
yeah, it's in the general chat. I pointed that out a while ago and read it out. Anyways, um, essentially what happened was Abraham moved to the land of Canaan. He adopted El as the Most High God. Especially when he met Melchizedek. This is in Genesis chapter 14. Later on, though, you see that the narrative changes and that Jews later on don't worship El, they worship Yahweh. They become Yahwehs. And over time, what happened was that El and Asherah were the divine couple, and then Jews started believing in Yahweh because Yahweh, the Jews are Yahweh's people. Yahweh became the God of the Jews. And essentially, they started believing that Yahweh was married to his original mother, Asherah, and then there was a lot of internal drama that went on, and eventually they got rid of Asherah worship because it prevented them from, well, it hurt them because they were a patriarchal society. They were not as egalitarian as we are today. And I think that the priesthood did this intentionally so that they could retain more power over women and use women as property. Also, they could justify their warriors going out, killing women, and taking women as spoils of war to be their wives. This also explains why women are treated as property and women only get rights because of their fathers, because they are still seen as property of their fathers. And essentially what ended up happening is a Yahwistic cult ended up becoming really anti-women, and this still affects us to this very day because we kind of got on this topic after talking about Roe v. Wade, and I do think Yahwism plays a huge role in why women are seen as not having a choice over their own bodies.
Bro, I just searched all your messages and I didn't see this verse.
I said Shogun posted it.
Oh, let me see.
And again, there's an entire channel of sources for the claims that Zoo is making. Hopefully you can review them in your own good time, Doug. But I would like to do a closing outro. So if you want to take the last word, Doug, that'd be great.
Just give me 1 second. Oh, bro. I actually need to get this back. What I'll do. Here's what I'll do. Look, man, at the end of the day, you're making just a bunch of hearsay about the lives of millions of people over the course of 1400 years. And basically, you're doing nothing better than demonizing them at having no real plans in their lives or hearts or thinking about their days, like life to lives. You're like, I don't like, this is a huge, like, but maybe misappropriate, but like, it was kind of like watching a Klan member talk about how black people have been bad for 1400 years because of fried chicken and watermelon. Like, it's well, a lot of the statements you made about the scriptures just haven't proven true at all. It and this whole thing with Deuteronomy, with the Most High El Elyon gave their nations to their inheritance. He separated humanity. He fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number defined. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob along the heritage. So Yahweh's El Elyon there. Like, they're consistently the same person in the Old Testament. The themes of the Old Testament are consistent with the New Testament. Like, and the themes are redemption and resurrection. It's been true since Genesis. Like, Abraham, the reason why he was ready to sacrifice Isaac, because God had promised Abraham that Isaac would have children. So if God turns around and asks Abraham to kill Isaac, then Abraham's only logical conclusion is that God is going to bring Isaac back from the dead. And that whole thing is a symbol for resurrection. So, there's strange things in that book and there's things that don't make sense, but it's a consistent piece, and the consistent piece is restoring fallen mankind.
Okay, so I want to thank you guys both so much for this amazing discussion, which is also an excellent contribution to our ongoing series of podcasts on this specific topic. We've probably done, 10 of them by now, and this was a huge addition, and it was great that I didn't have to say anything. I've just been listening and enjoying every minute of this. So thank you, Doug. Great to see you on the server. Hope to have you on the podcast more often in the future. Thank you, Zoo. Fantastic scholarship from both of you guys. And do you want to make does anyone feel the need to make one final statement before I wrap it up? Either of you?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Doug for this enlightening discussion and everything. I thought it went really well. I enjoyed hearing what you had to say, your input, and hearing things from your perspective. So I'm very grateful for such.
It's nice to see you do your homework, and there's like you did bring up like the whole historical record of Israel, but it's just a matter of like, are people interpreting the history or interpreting what they want? And that's something that we both fall prey to.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. A fantastic debate. You're both gentlemen and scholars, and we love to have this kind of conversation. It's a blessing to have such high-level members in the server. You guys both deserve an honorary master's degree in comparative mythology and theology, as far as I'm concerned. That being said, thank you both. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to everybody listening on YouTube. Make sure you have subscribed to the YouTube channel of the Temple Mount Discord server. We have amazing episodes dropping every single day. We have a church service of the Anglican Church of Canada dropping in about 60 minutes live. This will be uploaded to that same channel. Make sure you've joined the Temple Mount Discord server, where we record these podcasts every single day and where we have amazing high-level live conversations and discussions 24/7. You are not going to want to miss out. So join that server, subscribe to that channel, and thank you guys both. God bless. Let's jump to the forum, or rather the Templar Tavern, for the remainder of the evening. Keep an eye on the announcements channel for upcoming events. There's going to be a lot of them in the next 2 days. And remember, whatever you do, do not take the mark of the beast. God bless.